Social Impact Live, our weekly conversation with members of the Columbia School of Social Work community. I'm your host, Richard Hara, and I'm pleased to welcome to the program today Zachary Parolin, PhD, a postdoctoral researcher at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at the Columbia School of Social Work. So Zach, welcome back to the program since you were here in the fall, right?
That's right. Thanks, Richard. It's good to be back and to discuss a very timely and important topic today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I thank you for coming. And I know you've been an expert and looking into issues of poverty, not just in the United States, but also internationally. So, and I imagine this is work that's ongoing, but now thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, and I mean, we're still in the midst of things, and you know, you've been able to come up with some amazing work projecting what the impact of this pandemic might be on you know, poverty levels here in the United States. So, can you tell me a little bit about how this work came about?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the broad challenges. And that's that the Census Bureau, which reports the official estimates of poverty in the United States, has to do so with a considerable lag. So right now in April 2020, for example, the latest estimates of poverty we have are from the year 2018. Mm-hmm. And that's just because it takes time to go do the proper sampling and so forth. So what we're trying to do is use some tools to be able to say, okay, if unemployment reaches 10% today, or 20%, what does that mean for poverty rates more than likely? And so we've tried to build a model that allows us to make those type of predictions and to understand not only what level, how high will poverty rates go, but also who is most likely to be affected when we think about racial and ethnic composition, when we think about children versus adults, and so on. And that's what we've done. We've just released our first report today that projects poverty rates in the U.S. at different levels of unemployment. And I know we'll talk about that more during the program.
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to take this moment to remind our viewers that we reserve the last 10 minutes of the program for Q&A proper. But if you've got a question, please submit them now on the chat box. And if during the course of the interview we have an opportunity to bring the question into the conversation, we'll definitely do that. So just wanted to remind our viewers. So, okay, so you've got a model and you've got these projections, and I see that your work has already been cited in a New York Times article coming out today. You know, that this is really historic. What's happening now and what this means, that we might see poverty levels that are, that haven't been seen for 50, 60 years here in the United States. So again, you know, what's the basis and what are you predicting for poverty levels here in the United States?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that in sort of a, perhaps not worst case, but in a very bad scenario where unemployment rates climb to 30%, which is close to one projection from the Federal Reserve for the unemployment rates at the end of the summer. If those unemployment rates stay at 30% throughout the year on average, we're looking at poverty rates like we have not seen, at least in the last 50 years, the time frame for which we have reliable data. That would mean, according to our projections, if we reach that 30% benchmark, that would mean about 1 in every 5 residents of the United States would be living in poverty, higher than the Great Recession, the highest level on record since 1967. Now, hopefully that 30% benchmark is too high. Hopefully unemployment does not actually reach that level. So let's say it only reaches 10%.
Okay.
Then we are looking at poverty rates that rival those that we saw during the Great Recession 10 years ago. So that's sort of a rosier projection And that's obviously still not good. If we are back to where we were during the Great Recession around 2010 and 11, not long ago. So those are the broad numbers, depending on, again, what level of unemployment we reach. And then we also make some projections in there about if employment rates recover this quickly, then of course poverty rates will be lower. But again, in some of our best case scenarios, we're looking at potentially poverty rates as we saw during the Great Recession.
So certainly, depending on that unemployment number, the predictions could be adjusted and so on. Are there other sort of caveats or considerations for your model that need to be brought in?
Absolutely. So those who have been following some of the policy developments recently might be aware of the CARES Act, or a big set of legislation that includes the emergency cash assistance and the stimulus checks that many people have now received, the expansions to unemployment insurance. As of now, our projections have not yet modeled those in. Mm-hmm. So there's no doubt that when we do model those in, which we are working on actively, poverty rates will be a little bit less than what we are projecting now. These programs are important, and it's hard to say yet if they are sufficient. Probably not, but it's an important first step in reducing some of the hardship that Americans are going to face as a result of this crisis.
So, related to just the unpredictability of certainly of what things might look like in the next month, 3 months, 6 months, and so on. I was wondering if your model also has or looks at what the differential impact might be of unemployment rates on, different racial and ethnic groups, age and so on. What does that look like?
Sure. So I'll start with the projections we're putting forth about differential poverty rates by race and ethnicity. We are seeing larger increases for Black Americans and larger increases for Hispanics in the United States relative to, say, the increase in poverty rates for white Americans. And to understand why this might be the case, we need to think again about the types of jobs that are most affected by the current economic slowdown and who's working in those jobs. Mm-hmm. When we think of the service sector, for example, when we think of restaurants, when we think of hotels and accommodation, these types of industries, we see that Hispanics are particularly overrepresented in these types of occupations and industries. Again, many Black Americans as well. And so it's not too much of a surprise that when these are the jobs that are lost, that it's Hispanics and Blacks that are particularly affected. And that shows up in our scenarios that, similar to what we saw during the last recession, it is likely to be the case that Blacks and Hispanics are affected at an even greater rate than white Americans. Of course, everyone's going to be hit. This is not an easy time for anybody, but these are some of the racial disparities we're seeing. We're also seeing particularly large increases for children, so child poverty is on the rise, and for working age adults, some smaller increases for retirement age adults because many of them are not actively working. But again, it's these are the differentials, but there's no doubt that it's a tough time for all of these groups.
Could you sort of expand a little bit on why children are particularly vulnerable in this scenario for at risk for falling into poverty?
Yep. The short answer is that children are often living with parents or guardians who are working, and when these adults lose their jobs, that funnels into greater increases in child poverty as well. Larger families that have more children in them are already more likely to be in poverty than, say, a family with just one child or two children. And so this has particularly hard effects for larger families and really for all children who are living in households that are affected by the crisis. If one of their parents or guardians loses their job, that's going to funnel into higher poverty rates. And just points to the importance of making sure that the policy response is adequate to protect against some of the scarring effects that we know might occur if children are living in poverty for an extended period of time.
Okay. Well, obviously, we want to think about populations at risk, right, and people who are vulnerable. And one of the questions that we've gotten already is how can we protect people with disabilities during this time? Is there a connection between disability and poverty levels, risk factor, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. We know that even in normal times, individuals with disabilities are more vulnerable. They're at greater risk of poverty, greater risk of hardship, less likely to just be able to go and take an open job nearby.
Mm-hmm.
So especially in times of crisis, it's quite important that the policy response again is adequate to protect individuals with disabilities. A couple direct ways to do that. Many individuals with disabilities are receiving government assistance in the form of supplemental security income or other programs. So one very direct way, again, to protect individuals with disabilities in this time of crisis is just to increase those benefit levels and making sure that they can still meet their basic needs and live a decent life in spite of the current economic situation.
So this brings us to the question of what can policy do, right, to mitigate the effects of unemployment, rising poverty levels, and so on. What's worked in the past, and I think, a point of comparison that you provided us was the Great Recession. And what does recovery look like, and what role does policy play in stimulating that kind of recovery?
Yeah, the policy response is important at every phase of the crisis and the recovery. So right now, it's hard to even think about recovery. It's really just making sure that as we ask individuals to stay home from their jobs in many cases, or many individuals are losing their jobs, we need to make sure these folks can meet their basic consumption needs, that they have the means necessary to put food on the table, to be able to pay their rent, so they are not facing extreme hardship or even potentially a loss of their home or their apartment during these tough times just because they happen to be on the losing end of this unemployment crisis. So when it comes to policy response, it has to be direct cash assistance to as many of the affected individuals as possible. Now we've seen that already a little bit from the CARES Act through the stimulus payments. But if this crisis goes on into the summer and longer, there's no doubt that we are going to need more of these payments, again, just to make sure that individuals out there can meet their basic needs. Because right now we see stories of struggle all over the country. We see lines at food banks that are just going line by line through parking lots in order to get food. And this is one of many examples of the pain that a lot of Americans are facing right now.
Yeah, so it may be premature to be looking down the road as far as what a return to previous levels of employment might look like, and so on. So I thank you for that point.
It's of course right. It's of course important to start thinking about what the recovery looks like when we have the environment to where it's safe enough for individuals to start going to work again and to be in public, and when we need those jobs to come back right away. This is another opportunity for the government to step in and again provide more stimulus checks like it's doing now, but in an environment where people can actually feel comfortable and safe to go to that restaurant down the road or to walk into the supermarket and buy the groceries, etc., without facing the fear of the health risks that are currently present in many places throughout the US. So it's not too soon to start thinking about the recovery, but of course, it's hard to think about the recovery before we have the virus under control.
Yeah. I've got a question here from the audience, and it sort of raises the issue of the informal sector, right, of the economy, and how that figures into your models. For example, India has a huge unorganized sector, if you will, and the people working as industrial labor are the worst hit by the pandemic. And so what sort of government policies can we be looking at for for relief for these populations. And I assume that we have an analog here in the United States as well.
Yeah, of course, we certainly do. And maybe I would broaden the definition beyond informal work and just say precarious work or atypical work. Think even, for example, workers in the gig economy, your Uber and Lyft drivers and so forth. Right now, many of these individuals are struggling to acquire the unemployment insurance, and even with the expansions to unemployment insurance that were passed as part of the CARES Act. In fact, many of them are not going to be able to access this type of unemployment insurance. So it just speaks to the necessity of making sure that our response is universal, that the stimulus checks are one example, depending on how many low-income Americans can get into the IRS's system close enough, could potentially be universal for individuals with a Social Security number. So again, that still leaves out a lot of immigrants in particular. But all of this points to the necessity of a response that is universal in nature, that reaches everyone in the most efficient way possible, regardless of whether you had a job before or not, or whether your job was in the formal sector or not, or whether you were born in this country or not. Everyone is struggling right now, and the response needs to be universal. And that's the only way to, I think, address the problem that the person asking the question has raised.
Yeah. And I'm still, sort of struggling, if you will, to understand how, as you said, the census data and so on, there's a time lag. What sort of data are you going to be looking at sort of in real time to try to track what's going on, in these different areas and so on, and trying to sort of see correlations? Yeah.
So the best and most frequent source of data we have right now is on individuals filing for unemployment insurance. And we've seen over the past, this is a number that's released on a weekly basis. There were new numbers reported today. And we've seen over the last month, something around 20 million individuals applying for unemployment insurance. No doubt this is a record high. So we are trying to use this data, along with other sources of data, to, again, make informed estimates of what the unemployment rate might be today. And when we have that estimate of what the unemployment rate is or what range it could fall in, then we can use our data to make informed estimates of what the poverty rate might increase to. So that's the most frequent and most reliable source of data we have, is this weekly unemployment insurance claims data. And again, what we're seeing from that is record increases and the number of individuals applying for unemployment insurance.
Okay. I have a question here that came a bit early on, so my apologies for not getting to it earlier. As saying or commenting, 1 in 5 high school students have not logged in at all to their digital schoolwork here in Utah, and it's falling along racial economic lines. How can we better support students from a distance? And I think it's the support question, and also how it puts students at further risk, right, of falling into poverty related to their education and so on.
It's a hugely important question, and it's a huge issue that is just so hard to address right now. It's a fact that when we switch to this remote learning, when we start using computers and wireless internet to provide our education, there's a couple fundamental issues. Number one, many households just don't have Wi-Fi at the moment, or computers or laptops that they can log into to allow their 6-year-old or their 7-year-old to communicate with their classroom. So that's the first technical challenge. Number two, even if that need is met, it's still a reality that many children don't have their own bedrooms where they can go in and study in peace or log into their classroom. There's great research out there that shows that the overcrowding of homes, or the number of children relative to the bedrooms in the home, has increased in recent years, more families doubling up out of economic necessity. And when we try to ask these children now to, with 3 or 4 others in the room, to log into their first grade class, I don't, it's hard to imagine how that's going to be an incredibly effective way of providing an education. Of course, it's necessary now, but I think that the person asking this question is on to an incredibly important point, that there are disparities in the learning environment that have to be addressed.
And I'm wondering about, sort of differences in experience for people who all nominally fall under this category of, being in poverty, and, those who more recently, right, sort of might have been just above that poverty level, and as a result of the pandemic and current circumstances and difficulties, sort of qualify or meet the criteria for poverty, as opposed to what you mentioned in your brief about deep poverty and so on. I mean, are people in deep poverty, and if you could define that, is it more difficult for them to sort of get out of poverty over time?
Yeah, it's an important question. So deep poverty is defined as living with resources below half the poverty threshold. So say you're a family of 4 in Phoenix, Arizona. If your annual income is below roughly $11,000 for that whole year, you're in deep poverty. And of course, that's a pretty low amount for a family of 4. We're estimating in February 2020, before the crisis, something like 4% of Americans are in deep poverty. And of course, we're seeing our projections of deep poverty rising pretty steeply if unemployment does reach certain levels and persist over time. And deep poverty is a particularly acute form of poverty. It's associated with even greater material hardship and deprivation, greater likelihood of eviction and not being able to pay the rent, greater likelihood of going to sleep hungry and not having breakfast for the children in the morning. These are some of the most vulnerable individuals in our country right now. And there's no doubt that they're also some of the individuals facing these challenges with the learning environment as it exists at the moment. And again, just being able to meet those basic needs to put food on the table during the present crisis.
In short, all those adverse childhood events that are shown to influence all sorts of future outcomes for these children, right, in terms of health um, and so on. So, yeah, obviously it's a difficult picture, and thinking about what might be coming down the line can seem pretty daunting. So coming back to what we can do now in the moment to kind of mitigate the worst effects of it, there's a question here. Personally, every individual is facing financial setbacks in terms of paying rents, and most of us aren't even being able to make ends meet. How important do you feel is tax relaxations from the government's end, tax transfer, that issue?
Yeah, I think the immediate response that is needed is, again, direct cash payments to all residents in the US. That's what's needed. I think the person asking this question is right on the money, that this is a universal challenge, of course, affecting some groups much more than others, but the most efficient response right now is a universal one, just using all the tools we have from federal and state governments to make sure that we are getting resources into the hands of all households out there, all individuals, so that they can meet their basic needs right now. We're asking people in many cases not to go to work. And so when we do that, we need to make sure that they still have the money to pay rent.
Yeah. So let me ask you, I mean, the many billions of dollars that are going to corporations, do you think they should go into the pockets of individuals and families who need it the most?
Yeah, I think that's safe to say. I think that it would be great to see more money going directly into the hands of families and households across the country. There are other approaches that other countries are trying to preserve job loss, so paying firms directly so that the firms can then retain their employers and continue to pay their wages without having to send them all to unemployment. That's another strategy that would be effective and work slightly differently. But the bottom line is, keeping wages and money in the hands of as many individuals as possible.
Is that similar to the small business loans that, well, from what I understand they're running out of what they ran out of money yesterday, but the same purpose.
A similar intent. The small business loan program would be on a much smaller scale. So for only small businesses, and really only small businesses who can access those loans and who can then use that money to maintain their workforce. What other countries are attempting, particularly throughout the European Union, is to not just small businesses, but as many firms as possible, provide them the means to make sure they can retain their workforce, continue to pay maybe 75% or some set rate of their wages, so that when we do get to the recovery, again, it's much easier just to, everyone's still employed, you can get back to normal a little bit quicker, and we're not seeing these massive losses in income during the crisis.
So again, to go back to the Great Recession and what government was able to do to sort of prop up the economy, to protect certain assets, and banks that were too big to fail, and so on. I mean, does the evidence really support that approach? That when things do improve now, we need those companies to provide the jobs for people to go back to, and that's where the money needs to go. I don't want to sort of say that it's just a zero-sum game, and you can't maybe try to do a little bit of both, and obviously that's what's being negotiated in Congress, but is it effective, and is this something that we can actually put a certain amount of economic faith in?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that both approaches are needed. The big question is in the balance of how much we're giving to, say, banks and large corporations versus how much we're giving to families that are struggling out there. Both are needed, but right now I think it's fair to say that the balance is heavily tilted towards banks and large corporations, which again, it's important to try to preserve these job-creating institutions, but it's also important to make sure that a family out there in Kansas City or Phoenix or New York, Tallahassee, wherever, is able to pay their rent and is able to put food on the table now, at this very moment.
Well, apropos of putting food on the table, I have a comment from an audience member. I've read the state of New York is offering 3 free meals per citizen every day in New York City. Do you know if this is something that's working out fine and could be expanded somewhere else as well, rather than cash transfer? I mean, food programs, things like that. Does that figure into how we can address this issue of people falling into poverty?
It's certainly one important tool. I'll speak particularly for schools. For many children, particularly from low-income families, their schools might be the only place during the day where they get a nutritious meal, where they get a warm meal. And so with schools closing across the country, there's the risk that many of these children don't have that food. Mm-hmm. And so what many schools, particularly in New York, but I think across most of the country, have done is to continue to provide those school meals for children. That's been incredibly important. Food support is important, but it cannot be a sole replacement for cash assistance at the moment. Both are needed, but food you need to survive. It doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't buy diapers, etc. Both are important, and we just need to keep that in mind.
And so I don't know if this is a somewhat irresponsible question to ask you, but because I don't know if this necessarily is the case, but people who are receiving direct payments in cash, and so is there a mechanism for ensuring accountability that the monies are going for necessities and paying the rent and so on, instead of other kinds of expenses, etc., that could be regarded as more discretionary, let's say?
There's not that type of framework now, but I think many of us would argue that there doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
For even in normal times when low-income residents of this country receive cash assistance, on almost all occasions, except for the few that make the news, they're using that money to try to get by, again, to pay rent or to get food. Even if, this is the stimulus checks are going to many people with higher incomes as well.
Mhm.
And, that's to ensure that we have a pretty efficient policy response. If these individuals want to go spend it on, I don't know, flights or whatever, I mean, from the perspective of stimulating the economy, that's still not a bad thing. So that's
Yeah,
all.
and I think I read somewhere you mentioned people who might be able to donate their sort of stimulus checks, and I think there is a movement to get that money into the hands of immigrants and so on who may not have access to government benefit programs. So that's certainly another way that that money can be good put to good use.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great point. A lot of local nonprofits out there as well that try and provide food and essential services and support to residents who are perhaps excluded from these payments throughout the country. And that would be a good place if you don't need your stimulus check or if you have some spare money to be able to donate to those types of organizations.
All right. Well, Zach Parolin, thank you again for joining us here at Social Impact Live. It's been wonderful having you as a repeat guest.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate it.
All right, and thank you all for joining us today. Our next program will be next Tuesday when we'll be hosting me and Chris and Samantha Winter to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on environmental justice issues. So again, thanks for joining us here. Stay well, stay safe. See you all next time. Bye-bye.